According to the FBI, no one has ever successfully escaped Alcatraz prison in California. According to them, there have been 36 inmates that made 14 separate prison escape attempts that were all unsuccessful. They either drowned, they were killed, or they got caught and were brought back to Alcatraz. However, this does not seem to be the case for three men. So in 1962, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were all placed together side by side in cells in Alcatraz in cell block B. Frank Morris was a known escape artist, and that's why he was actually taken to Alcatraz, because authorities basically hoped that by bringing him here, he wouldn't be able to escape, because Alcatraz is surrounded by water, and the water is cold and harsh, so it would be very hard to get out. And of course, it's Alcatraz, so the security should be better, right? But when I dug into this case, it seemed like the security here was kind of a joke. John and Clarence Anglin also had made prior escape attempts from prison, so they were all known flight risks. And by the way, on episode 78 of my podcast, Perplexity, I really dove deep into this story. It's very Looney Tunes and crazy. It's fascinating, impressive, funny. So if you guys end up being interested in this Alcatraz escape story and want to learn more, go check that out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So in January of 1960, Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz, and not much longer later, the Anglin brothers would arrive. They all had charges for bank robbery, and it didn't take long since they were all in side-by-side cells for them to all become pretty good friends. So together, along with another inmate named Alan West, they began to hatch an escape plan. And they bided their time. They made this plan for over a year. They managed to gather materials to create makeshift dummy heads out of soap, toilet paper, this like concrete paste mixture. So they created likenesses of themselves, and they ended up leaving them in their beds. June 11th, 1962, they were ready to make their escape. So after their final head count at night, the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris would escape using the little air vents in their cells. They had been digging away at these vents for months. Really impressive. It was like 8-inch thick concrete walls. So they would squeeze through these tiny, narrow vents, and they eventually shimmied their way up to the roof of Alcatraz. They then went down these really long poles on the side of the building called smokestacks. Then they made it out to a beach, and there they were ready with a raft that they had already built out of raincoats that they stole from the prison. And the reason that everybody was able to figure out what the men's plan was is because Alan West, the man that had helped them hatch this whole plan, ended up having to stay behind in the prison. Alan West would also tell authorities that the men had planned to make it to go to Angel Island, and they were planning to steal a car and then just go live their lives from there. A massive manhunt would ensue. The FBI got involved, but there was no sign of the men. Eventually, the FBI closed the case in 1979, and they presumed that the men had drowned. However, the case was handed over to the U.S. Marshals, who continued to investigate. This would continue to go on for some time until eventually the U.S. Marshals would also close the case. However, in 2013, they were forced to reopen the case when they received a letter from a man claiming to be none other than John Anglin. John Anglin, if it was him, said in this note that he, Frank Morris, and his brother Clarence all did successfully escape from Alcatraz, then went on to live full lives. The reason John Anglin was writing to authorities is because he wanted to make a deal with them. His deal was, I will go to prison for no more than a year and tell you everything I know if you give me medical treatment because I have really bad cancer. But the letter's authenticity remains unconfirmed. They did analyze the handwriting of the letter and check for fingerprints, DNA, but nothing was found. In 2015, there were also alleged photographs that surfaced that appeared to be John and Clarence Anglin. According to the photographer, who was one of their friends, a man named Fred Brizzi, the men had bumped into Fred in Rio de Janeiro, 13 years after their escape. This photo would spread throughout the media and reignite the theory that the men had escaped and fled the country. A forensic expert even analyzed the photo to compare their faces and do age progression, and the forensic expert found it was highly likely that these were the men, John and Clarence. But some people are still uncertain if the men made it out of San Francisco Bay alive or if they drowned. After all, the FBI still says that the men drowned. But if that's the case, why did they help the U.S. Marshals when they reopened the case? And why did they release age progression photos made none other than the FBI? The Alcatraz escape continues to be a mystery that perplexes people over 60 years later. And like I said, this is a really fun and interesting story, and there's a lot more to it. So if you want to hear more, it is episode 78 of Perplexity, a mystery podcast, and it's available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.